Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to see such a great turnout. This is very exciting. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon on this special half-day symposium presented in conjunction with our exhibition, Divine Egypt. My name is Diana Craig Patch, and I'm the Lila Atchison Wallace Curator in Charge of Egyptian Art here at the Met. We're all delighted in the department to spend the afternoon with you exploring the unique festivals that celebrate the gods of ancient Egypt. And I would like to take a moment right now to thank the funders for today's event. This program is made possible by the Cora Foundation, and I just said hello to Robin Took, and I really want to say thank you to her directly. And the exhibition itself is made possible by the John A. Moran Charitable Trust, and additional support was provided by the Kalekian Fund, Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman, Alina and Sterling Larkin, and Norby Anderson. I'm very grateful to all of those people for their dedicated support of the programming of our department. Today we are joined by three remarkable scholars, Emily Teeter, Betsy M. Bryan, and Foy Scaff. Emily is going to kick off today's lecture. She holds a PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago. Currently, she's a research associate at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. Some of you may remember it as the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. And she is also a Nagani Integrative at the Integrative Research Center. She also is a research associate there. That is located at the Field Museum in Chicago. And she is co-curating the new Egyptian and African galleries at the Field Museum, which are now scheduled to open in the spring of 2028. But for many years, I knew her as the curator and special exhibition coordinator at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. Her area of specialty in research is material culture, religion, and social history. She is the author of many books, including Religion and Ritual in Ancient Egypt, Ancient Egypt Treasures from the Collection of the Oriental Institute, and Egypt and the Egyptians, which has now appeared in Arabic and Turkish as well. 2 volumes document the small finds from Medinet Habu, and most recently she wrote Chicago on the Nile, a century of work by the Epigraphic Survey of the University of Chicago. She also wrote the introductory chapter to our catalog for our exhibition, Divine Egypt. She's also the lead author of an extensive online catalog of the Egyptian collection at the Art Institute that appeared earlier this year. Emily has curated many permanent and temporary exhibitions at the museum at ISAC, and she has also consulted on or curated Egyptian galleries in Seattle and St. Louis. And she's been involved with a wide range of other museum and multimedia projects. In addition, when she wasn't doing all of those things, she was the past president of the American Research Center in Egypt, and she serves as the editor of that organization's academic journal. She is also on the board of the International Committee for Egyptology Curators and Writings of the Ancient World. So it is my great pleasure now to invite Emily up to the stage to give her presentation, Ancient Egyptian Festivals and the Feast of Opet. Emily?
Thank you, Diana. I am absolutely delighted to be here. Of course, being an Egyptologist, the Metropolitan is ground zero. So, and I was delighted to be involved in writing for the catalog of this really splendid show, Divine Egypt. If you have not seen it, see it. If you've seen it, go back and see it again. So, my topic today, I was assigned, is Ancient Egyptian Festivals, so a little bit of general background, and the Feast of Opet. Just some opening remarks. Festivals were a very important part of life and belief in ancient Egypt. The Egyptian calendar was filled with holidays and festivals. It really makes you wonder how they got anything done, because there are so many festivals and days off. Most festivals in ancient Egypt were related to rebirth, whether to the king or the gods, or to individuals, or to the confirmation of the legitimacy and divinity of the king. We have many, many different types of festivals attested in ancient Egypt. Most of them were national, or at least widely regional, and many of them were attested throughout very, very long spans of time, for 1,000 years or more. The sort of evidence we have, first of all, we have a lot of evidence for these festivals. We have scenes on temple walls, like here, the Festival of Min and Medina Habu. There is a tradition of incising the walls of temples with festival calendars from the Old Kingdom, about the time of the pyramids, on into the Greco-Roman period, here at the Temple of Kamambo, over 700 years later than this great calendar in Medina Habu. The whole south side of this temple is covered with scenes and texts talking about festivals over which the king presided, and his links with the earthly realm, the gods, and the ability of the king to maintain the order of the cosmos, or Ma'at, as he satisfied the gods in the name of the community, so that the equilibrium of the cosmos could continue. So the king and the gods, jointly with these festivals, are doing a lot more than just being in festival. It has a much wider implication for cosmic order in ancient Egypt. These festivals are all part of the transactional nature of Egyptian religion. This is a major feature of Egyptian religion. The king or the people honored or gave offerings to the gods in order to receive the deity's blessings. In fact, many people think that Egyptian religion is basically a series of offering rituals. Specifically, these offerings involved making offerings of bread, beer, eye paint, many, many different types of things in the temple context by the king, who is seen as a protector of the people in return for the guarantee of his longevity and hence his ability to protect Egypt and the people of Egypt from the omnipresent forces of chaos. So the king was this bridge between order and chaos. He is the exclusive, for most of Egyptian history, link or communicant with the gods until the later New Kingdom. The annual reenacting of rituals associated with the holidays gave structure to the society, and this seems to be an important part of this. So much like today, and probably this is why we have this theme of festivals today, Christmas, Ramadan, Rosh Hashanah, all mark the passing of the year. Now, a little bit of background. In ancient Egypt, religious beliefs and the gods were omnipresent. The deity, in the form of a precious statue, like this one from the Miho Museum in Japan, lived in a naos in the temple sanctuary. So here, the naos, in the very deepest, darkest part of the temple, is called the Jesser Jesseru, or the Holy of the Holies. This area was accessible only to the king and his deputized priests. But the lower level of priests had access to other parts of the temple, in spite of not being able to have access to this sanctuary. It's very important also to keep in mind that a significant number of men and women acted as part-time priests, and they were in the temple, although barred access to the most sacred areas, the point being that they had a general awareness of what was going on within the temple. And this knowledge is reinforced by the many reliefs that they would have seen that were carved on the walls of the temples. Although we do have sections of temples that we know were off limits to the general public or to lower levels of priests. For example, here at the Ramesseum, we have markings on the doorways that say, all you who enter this door be twice pure. So it's very clear that there are parts of the temple that people could enter and other parts that they could not. But it's also important to remember that the general population was allowed access into large parts of these temples. Although areas were restricted by levels of purity in the dynastic period, this was not really a mystery religion because many, many people were in these temples, at least in certain parts of the temple. In the ancient, as in the modern world, festivals and holidays were looked forward to as a time of special foods, days off work. We know this particularly from texts from Deir Medina. It sometimes was a period when people would wear new clothes. There was socializing, drinking, as Betsy Bryan will discuss further, and eating. And in retrospect, festivals probably paid played a perhaps not very well recognized role in social stability as safety valves to diffuse tension and potential resentment in a very highly stratified society. As you know, Egypt was sort of like a pyramid, a very small elite at the top and a very large group of agricultural workers at the bottom. As Ellen Morris has suggested, during some festivals, people were encouraged to overeat, drink to excess, to express a temporary freedom from want in the context of a festival. A major feature of Egyptian festivals was processions of the god, because during celebrations, the deity of the temple, who lived in the back of the temple, traveled from his or her own residence, the sanctuary, to the residence of another god. This visit could be a local trip, or it could be one of several hundred kilometers. In essence, the deity, who normally lived in the back of the temple, abandoned their seclusion, as it said in ancient Egyptian texts, and became accessible to the general population. This is not unique to ancient Egypt. Ritual processions of the deity in much of the world, you think about Central America, Mediterranean Basin, India, where you have these grand processions of images of the god on the shoulders of devotees and being processed through the streets. This is very much what's going on in ancient Egypt. Many festivals, especially those of Osiris, which Dr. Scalf will talk about, were commemorated throughout Egypt, but there were also more local ones. Now, Thebes, modern Luxor, is a good example of the prevalence of local festivals. We have lots and lots and lots of festivals preserved from this area. They are particularly well documented by scenes in temples and tombs, and also by autobiographical texts, people talking about participating in the festivals. Many of these scenes show how the temples on the east and west banks were part of a sacred network. Generally, in many Egyptology books, they give the impression that the temples on the west, the land of the dead, the funerary areas, were quite separate from the temples on the east, or the festival temples of Karnak and Luxor. But in fact, in the course of festivals, these temples were very, very directly linked as part of a major domain of Amun. And in the course of these festivals, the gods who dwelled in the east traveled to the west. These processions that crossed the river were great events, and we have, again, many autobiographical inscriptions, people talking about seeing these enormous processions crossing the river. Among these local festivals that linked the east and the west in Luxor was the beautiful Feast of the Valley, which is very much like the Day of the Dead, a time when families spent the night in the tombs of their deceased relatives. They communed with the spirits of the deceased, bringing them forth from their resting places by music, the smell of food, by drink, and during this festival there were great processions of the gods from the east bank through the west bank, and it processed through the necropolis shown here and ended up at the Temple of Dera Bahri at the top of the screen. So this was a very, very big event with great public participation in Luxor. Another of these festivals in Luxor was the Decade Festival, which, by its name, was held every 10 days. And during the course of this festival, the god Amenem-Ope of Luxor Festival crossed the river and then visited this temple called Djeserset at Medinet Habu. And there, the god was thought to be reborn. He was visiting the tomb of his mothers and fathers, the special group of gods. So again, the idea being that festivals really brought the east and west banks of Luxor together. Now, the festival I want to talk about this evening, this afternoon, is very local to Luxor and is exclusive to Luxor. It is the Feast of Opet, or the Festival of Opet, the annual festival of regeneration the king as the divine son of Amun. During the course of the Opet festival, the legitimacy of the king and his relationship to the gods, especially Amun, the king of the gods, was confirmed. So we have not only a festival of the gods, but here the king entering into a special quasi-divine relationship with the gods as he is rejuvenated as a son of the god Amun. Opet is known from the 18th dynasty, from the reign of Hatshepsut, who was a great innovator, or at least recorder. The first records we have are from the reign of Hatshepsut, about 1500 BC. It was celebrated down to at least 700 BC, so a very long time that this festival was enacted in Luxor. During the festival, the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the triad of Thebes, and the king left the Karnak temple to visit the southern temple of Luxor. And then at the end of the festival, it's about 1.7 miles between the two temples. So this is the god Amun, with whom the king is associated during the festival of Opet. Here we see the schematic of Luxor, and at the top of the screen is the Karnak temple, and at the bottom of the screen is the Luxor temple. In the course of the Opet festival, the gods and the king travel from the north to the southern harem, as it was called, to the Luxor temple. And then they reverse the progress at the end of the festival. Opet was celebrated once a year in the late summer. Initially, it lasted 11 days under Thutmose III, and gradually was extended until it was 24 days under Ramses III and 27 days under his successor, Ramses IV. Opet was the longest duration festival of any of the Luxor festivals, the Theban festivals. In the reign of Ramses III, it started on the 19th day of the second month, always roughly near the start of the inundation. People in Egypt traveled by boat on the Nile. Hence, when the gods wanted to leave their temple and travel, they would travel on boats. And here we have a diagram. The boat would be loaded on carrying poles. The boat itself has a shrine, and inside that shrine is the image of the god from the temple. So the image of the god was placed in a small shrine, placed in a larger shrine on this boat. And so, as I said, people in Egypt traveled by boat, and so the gods also traveled by boat. Egyptian temples in Upper Egypt are full of scenes of boats, because this refers to the passage of the gods from one part of the temple to another, or from one temple to another temple. Another view of this here from Medinet Habu, showing one of these boats. You can always tell who the boat belongs to by the heads on the bow and stern. This is a ram, and so this is the boat of the god Amun, who has a ram form. So representations of the Opet festival and its procession from Karnak to Luxor and back were marked by the boats of the deities and the king. Each boat, as I mentioned, is identified by the representation of the deity on the bow and stern. Now, the route of Opet changed over time. In Hatshepsut's time, it went by land to Luxor temple, and then back to Karnak by the Nile. By Tut, it was both ways on the Nile, so there's a fair amount of variation in what's going on with the route of the procession. Initially, in the earliest period, it is only the bark of Amun. Only Amun participated in the Opet festival. But by the reign of Tutankhamun, so about 1350, we have the extension of the festival, and it is Amun, his wife Mut, their child Khonsu, the great triad of Karnak, accompanied by the boat of the king. So four boats involved in the Opet festival. The sources that we have, Hatshepsut's temple at Dero Bahri has, as I said, the earliest representations of the Opet festival, but the fullest documentation of this festival is in the Luxor temple on the walls of the colonnade hall. This is the west wall. This enormously long hall shows the procession from Karnak to Luxor on the west wall, and on the east wall, the return voyage is shown, offering an enormous tableau of the different actions that comprise the Opet festival. Now, unfortunately, the reliefs in the colonnade hall here at Luxor Temple are very hard to see. They're badly weathered, and this is where the work of the University of Chicago's Epigraphic Survey has been so very, very valuable. So when I show you sections of the Opet festival, I will be showing some photographs and then also the line drawings of the Epigraphic Survey, where it's much easier to see what's actually on the wall. So what happened during the Opet Festival? Well, the procession, as we know, started from Karnak. The king's boat was apparently stored in this part in the back of the Karnak temple. It's called the Akhmenu, built by Thutmose III. Amun's boat was in his sanctuary, which was located to the west of this particular temple. The Opet scenes at Luxor begin, it's a little hard to see, but you've got Tutankhamun on the left, and you have Tut leaving the palace, being greeted by Amun and Mut as he offers to the sacred boats. And here, a little bit easier to see a line drawing. And so we see the great boats, the boat here, and then the other boats here. So this enormous procession at this point on land being assembled at the Karnak temple, getting ready to process south to the Luxor temple. At that time, they left the Karnak temple through, at the time that we're talking about, the front of the temple was here. Those of you who have been to Egypt or are familiar with the hypostyle hall, this did not exist. Karnak temple was like one enormous construction site. So in different periods, it looks very, very different, that the front of the temple was constantly changing. So in the Opet festival, the king's bark and the Amun bark would leave this way and go out through the 10th pylon. And in certain periods, and then they'd go by the Mut temple and collect Mut, and then also Khonsu would join from his temple down here. From there, if they're on a land procession, they enter the avenue of sphinxes that led from the Karnak temple to the Luxor temple. This is 1.7 miles of sphinxes, a processional way that linked those two temples. If the procession was on land, as I said, in certain periods it changes. We know from Hatshepsut that she built a series of 6 little kiosks between Karnak and Luxor. These are places where the priests, as you can see here, with the boat of Amun on their shoulders, being carried in procession, is then placed in this small wayside shrine, one of 6, space between the two temples. The thing about this is very important, is not only did it give the priests a little break, but it was also a way in which the population could swarm around the god and actually see the god, although the statue was within the shrine itself. And so here we have sort of stop action. We've got Amun here, and then we've got Amun greeting it. If southward by the Nile, the processional boat of Amun, the focus of the procession, was loaded onto Amun's great barge, shown here on the 3rd pylon, called Userhat, or Mighty of Prow. And this is one of the best representations of it. A text of Seti I in the hypostyle hall describes this boat as being of wood of the cedar terraces, the faces on it of gold wrought with lapis lazuli. Never had the like been done since the founding of the land, it being wrought with the best gold of the deserts, made to glitter with every kind of precious stone, the faces of gold, the headgear and lapis lazuli insignia upon its brow. His sacred image is within it. So what we have is a description of this boat. We know from other texts that this Userhat was 67 meters long in the New Kingdom, 220 feet long, an enormous ceremonial river and barge. This boat was actually in the water to convey the processional boats from Karnak to Luxor. And we have images of some of the decoration of the Userhat. Here we have a partial scene of the king defeating his enemies. And we have texts that talk about, in theory, the king as the main officiant rows his father being Amun, of course. But actually, as you can see, it's a galley with rowers, shown here, who row the great Userhat. But it wasn't only the rowers, because this great water parade was composed of a lot of different boats. And some of these so here's a scene showing the Userhat with the images that was referred to in the Seti I text the great figures in gold. And you even have these little duck-headed boats. So there was a whole flotilla, this massive riverine procession. Once on the river Userhat, and the smaller boats of Kansu, Mut, and the king were pulled upstream by galleys and by towmen on the sides of the bank. So here we see from the Luxor temple men pulling on these ropes. Here's the water above them and one of the holes of the boats, another boat back here that they're actually pulling. So we see this wonderful ecstatic sort of process of pulling the boats to south to the Luxor temple. We know that the men who were pulling the boats were high officials, priests, and other dignitaries. It was a great honor to be involved in this. Now, this procession was met by musicians and acrobats and heaps of food offerings. This was a tremendous time of jubilation in Luxor, in ancient Thebes. So here we see some of the, dancers doing backflips. We see musicians, people playing large drums up here. So what is wonderful to imagine is not only what we can see from the representations, but to try to imagine what it sounded like. It must have been very, very noisy. There were a lot of people involved, lots and lots of people singing, chanting, the music. And another image here of other musicians with clapsticks, people clapping to keep the beat. And then food was a very important part of this. We know from these representations of the Luxor temple that along the riverbank, there were all sorts of little booths that were set up to prepare offerings for the gods, but also probably to feed the participants. It's like you go to a parade today and there are places selling candy, cotton candy and other things like that. So this is all part of this great festival that involved the entire community. The boats then arrived at the Luxor temple, and this is a representation of the portal, the door of the Luxor temple at that point. And here, Tutankhamun pouring libations and presenting incense to offerings in front of the great boats of Amun, Mut, Kansu, and the king himself. So if the procession came by water, it would disembark and then would enter the Luxor temple through this western gate, which is, now this is a court of Ramses II, but this is the western gate by which the procession, all the boats would be taken off the large barges and then put back on the shoulders of priests and carried into the temple. If by land, the boats would be carried straight through into the temple. This would be the front of it during this time, and go straight in this way. So from the Avenue of Sphinxes, which is up here, it would come in this way. Now, a thing that's very interesting in the course of this festival is two boats, the boats of Mut and Kansu, break off from the main festival, the main procession, and are parked in these little places here. And the boat of Amun and the king, because they are the main participants in this festival, continue on into the deeper part of the temple. Offerings were made in the sanctuary of the temple, and the culmination of the ritual was the king being confirmed as the son of Amun. Now, Egyptian kings were not necessarily divine. They were quasi-divine, particularly in the New Kingdom. They express their divinity primarily in the course of rituals like the Opet festival. This idea of the king being the son of Amun is expressed specifically in this temple by divine birth scenes. These are a little bit earlier of Amenhotep III, where it shows the mother of the king in very close proximity to the god Amun. This is the way the Egyptians very discreetly represented the moment of conception. And then later, the king's Ka and the king himself being formed. And so again, this idea of during this union of the king and Amun, the divinity of the king as the son of Amun is stressed. And then there are also scenes of the king being suckled by the goddesses. We also have many other texts that talk about this idea of the king being rejuvenated, regenerated as a son of Amun with this continuing annual rebirth. For example, we have architraves in this temple that have specific references to a place where the king is rejuvenated, his transformations being visible. In some scenes, the name of the king and his ka, the ka being basically the idea of continuity of rulership, have been reversed. So again, this idea of the divinity of the king is being stressed. This union took place in the back of the temple. It is not surprising that Alexander the Great built a new bark sanctuary in the back of this temple, and also that the Roman emperors built a shrine to the Roman emperors in a little bit to the north of that shrine, because it was very clear that these much later rulers recognized the idea of the Luxor temple being a place of the divinity of the king and a place where his legitimacy was stressed. So all indications were that through antiquity, they understood the role of the Luxor temple in the legitimacy and renewal of the legitimacy of the king. Indeed, Luxor temple has been called a national shrine to the cult of the divine king. When the rituals were complete, the transfigured monarch, as he's called, was displayed to the people. And this is a time apparently of great jubilation. He would emerge from the dark part of the temple into an open courtyard where people could acclaim the king. Then the procession returned to Karnak, and the sacred boats were stowed in their resting places until the following year. By the way, this festival of Opet is quite remarkable in that it is still celebrated as a Islamic tradition in Luxor. It's called the Festival Abu Hagag, where very not straight line Islamic. There's a lot of folk religion that remains in Egypt as part of Islamic tradition. And in the course of Abu Hagag, there are boats that are paraded around the Luxor temple. It's very, very clear that this is a remnant of the ancient festival of Opet. The festival had wide-ranging implications. First, the architectural accommodation for the festival. The Avenue of Sphinxes, the 1.7-mile row of sphinxes that joined Karnak and Luxor, this was made specifically for these processions going from Karnak to Luxor. The temples have an axial plan, again, because the idea being these processions are coming in with boats. They want to go straight through. They don't want to be doing a lot of left-hand or right-hand turns. It's also very interesting as more poles were added to the support of the procession in honor of the god. This was done, each king wanted to show that he was even more pious than his predecessors. He would add poles to that processional boat, in other words, making it wider and wider. And we see this very interestingly in the colonnade hall of Luxor and in some other temples, where the round column bases have been shaved off to make the aisle wider. Because as they made the processions wider, they could no longer get to the original space that was originally designed for a narrower procession. The temples are also an incredible alternation of dark and light, places of privacy and places of displaying the king to his subjects when he was proclaimed by the people. Overall, Luxor Temple is like a beautifully designed stage set for maximum drama. For many years, it was a little bit unclear what the Luxor Temple was really all about. And now we know it is about the rejuvenation of the king. And many people have likened the Luxor Temple to one enormous bark shrine rather than a temple itself. But as I think about this festival, a thing I always like to think about when I think about Egyptian religion is, so what did it mean? What did it mean to the people involved? Public participation and the impact of the festival on the community was very, very great. We've seen that segments of the public accompanied the procession proper. There were the priests who carried the boat, it's called shouldering the boat. There were priests that held the fans that proclaimed the divinity and held other sacred implements. As we've seen, there were musicians, there were dancers, there were acrobats, there were soldiers in regiments that marched alongside the procession, and there were priests and other lay people who prepared food offerings for the gods and also for the participants. But what about the rest of the people? What did Opet mean to them? Now, certainly we know that people of ancient Thebes must have watched from the riverbank. They must have watched this procession go through, and perhaps they joined it as well. When the procession was on land, of course, they had very good views as well. Although parts of the temple were restricted to certain levels of priests, and other parts of the temple were accessible, but other parts of the temple were accessible, allowing the general public access to their god. For example, the first court at Luxor Temple has a people's gate on the east side of the first court. And there are other markings within this court, especially these markings on the column bases, which say the pot and the rekiat, two different terms for people, all the people give praise. This seems to be an indication that the ordinary people were allowed in this part of the temple during festivals, or we're not sure if it's generally or just during the festivals. But the point being that people who were not priestly could watch these festivals, and it's probably in this first court that the king was acclaimed as the son of Amun as he emerged from the very back, the very dark back of the temple. The people had the opportunity to see the god and to settle disputes during these festivals. This is a very interesting point, because the god is normally secluded in the back of the temple, but when he comes out in procession, people could actually have direct contact with the god. And as amazing as it seems, they could communicate with the god during these occasions. During these occasions, people would put questions to the god who was in the processional bark. These oracles were usually yes or no questions, and it's amazing that some of these were like very important questions and others were completely mundane. But these oracles were a very important part of community harmony. The god was able to settle low-level community disputes. And this is brilliant, because in a small community where everybody knows everybody else's business, for example, there was a matter of the theft of a goat. Everybody knows probably who stole the goat. But to confront that person would create social disharmony. And so you would take this matter to the oracle, and you would say, who stole my goat? This seems ridiculous, the god. But then the god would give his answer. And the way this is done in oracles is the boat was on the shoulders of the priests, and the boat would either move forward for yes or back for no. In some cases, the god would nod. What we think is going on is the god to say yes. He becomes so heavy, that's another term, he becomes very heavy, and he presses the first row of priests down, so the boat actually dips down as a yes. Now, this seems kind of ridiculous to us, but this was a major part of local jurisprudence in Egypt in the first millennium BC. It was a matter of faith, and it was a matter of very great importance. So a very famous example of this use of oracles is not an inconsiderable one. This is the oracular selection of a man named Nebwenenef as the high priest of Amun. Now, the high priest of Amun is one of the most important positions in ancient Egypt. This was held, we know from the written text, during the Opet festival in the first year of Ramses II. We know about this oracle held during Opet from texts in his tomb that relate that the god selected Nebwenenef from, quote, the whole entourage, including the spokesman of the troops. The priests of the gods and the officials of the domain who were before him, their names, were proclaimed for him, but the god was not content but with a single one among them when his name, Nebwenenef, was spoken. And the text continues, he, the Lord of the Ennead, is the one who chose you on account of your character. He advanced you on account of your excellence. So here we have a festival serving a completely different function. It's not only the divinity of the king and its legitimacy, but here the oracles are being used to settle bureaucratic issues and also some lower level ones. For example, we have another text on a papyrus in the British Museum about the theft of 5 tunics of cloth. Cloth, by the way, was very expensive and very valuable in ancient Egypt. And there's a man named Amen-Emwia who appealed to Amun during the procession of Opet. And the text says, "My good and beloved Lord, will you give me back their theft of the tunics?" And the god nodded very greatly. So in other words, the boat is nodding up and down, indicating that the god is hearing him. Then Amen-Emwia repeated the names of all the suspects. And the text says the god became very heavy at the mention of one of them, hence the accused. The accused was there, and he denied the charge. The text says, and the god was exceedingly wroth. So this means that the boat starts rattling. So the priests, of course, the priests are receiving these instructions from the god. And so you have this wonderful image of all these people gathered around this boat, and the boat rattling, because the god is very unhappy that he is being challenged. The accused then went to his own god, perhaps another oracle in the procession, and proclaimed his innocence, and that oracle confirmed the accusation. The accused claimed, "Help me, my beloved Lord, it is I who took the clothes." And the god nodded very greatly to say, "It is you who took them." So, although the acts, this is an image of a procession very much like the oracles. So here we have the priests carrying the boat of the god Amun here, as you can see from the ram, carrying the boat on their shoulders, the shrine with the statue of Amun within it. And so this is the sort of thing that would be involved in the oracles. These priests would be standing with the boat, and then they would be feeling the wishes of the god. Now, though the acts and beings involved in ancient holiday like Opet seem quite foreign, it shares much with modern holidays. It brought family and community together in a prescribed way. It provided a source of amusement, a day off, and a cause for celebration, and a break from everyday routines. But it also commemorated mythical or actual events. But I think what's very important is these festivals, like Opet, created a social solidarity and a sense of predictable rhythm to the course of the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. It was such a clear presentation of how festivals work, and there was so many pieces that I really didn't have a complete picture of. And for those of you who haven't seen Divine Egypt yet, in the fourth gallery, we have a recreated bark with our great gold statue of a moon. And on the wall behind the bark, you can see a video of the Moulid Abu Haggag, which is this famous modern festival, Muslim festival in Luxor, which uses these boats that were depicted on the temple wall. We worked with an Egyptian filmmaker, Sharif El-Katasha, who filmed the festival in this last year and put it together so you could see how an ancient Egyptian tradition had been borrowed and reconfigured in a new way in Egypt today. So we have a few minutes now, and we'll take a break because we need to start on the hour so that people who are coming for a specific presentation will be able to join it when it begins. So at 3 o'clock, we will start the second lecture by Betsy M. Bryan on the Mut Sakhmet festivals in Luxor. So I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Okay, everybody, we're ready to move on to our second lecturer. I'll give you a chance to find a seat and get ready. So before I invite Betsy up to present on the Moot Sakhmet Festival, I want to give you a little bit of background about Betsy. She received her PhD from Yale, and she is an art historian and a historian of ancient Egypt, and a specialist in particular in the period of the New Kingdom. She is a professor emerita of Egyptian art and archaeology at the Johns Hopkins University, but continues to teach part-time in the Near Eastern Studies Department. Her research interests include the organization and production of art and its social and cultural meanings. She's particularly interested in the performance and material expressions of Egyptian ritual, very appropriate for today, which is an important area of her research and relates directly to art in cultural context. Brian's studies on the cult of Moot Sakhmet are often cited by her colleagues, and they are fascinating, I have to say. Her long-term field projects in the Temple of Mut in South Karnak, and we've heard about Karnak already, and in the Theban tomb of the royal butler Siamenut on the west bank of Luxor, derived from her specific interests. But as all field projects do, have extended her research, for example, into the Second Intermediate period, so back in earlier time from the New Kingdom. Brian has also curated art exhibitions for the Cleveland Museum of Art and the National Gallery of Art, and has been a curator or director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum throughout her career at that university. It is my pleasure now to invite Betsy up to the stage to give her presentation, The Festivals of Drunkenness, very interesting, in the Temple of the Goddess Mut. Betsy?
Thank you, Diana. Thank you all for being here today, and I'm delighted to have been asked to come. I just got back from Egypt Tuesday night, and as you may be able to tell from my voice, I brought something back with me, and it wasn't a souvenir. So in any case, I'm going to try very hard to make it through talking to you about the festivals of drunkenness. And I'll start right off because we are going to be looking at the, the temple of the goddess Mut. So you heard already from Emily that the goddess Mut was the consort of the god Amun-Re of Karnak. And here you're looking at the Karnak temples, of course. The Mut precinct is the one on the right. But I'm not talking about that Mut today at all. I am talking about the Mut who represents a lot of different aspects associated with the sun god Ra rather than with Amun-Ra in particular. So the Mut temple is unfortunately preserved only in its foundations today, but we do have a good layout for it. We know what rooms were there. We know really fairly well when it was built and at what stages it was changed and modified. And my work there started in 2001, and we continued to work up until now, although I have passed the directorship to my younger colleague. And our work has really been to concentrate on the earlier time in the Mut temple. The earliest parts probably date to the Middle Kingdom, but the stone structure dates originally to the reign of Hatshepsut, somewhere around the 1470s BCE. Now, the goddess Mut is somewhat complicated. She actually has two very distinct visual forms, and you see her here on the Mut gate there on the left. seated as almost an enthroned queen. She wears a vulture headdress the way the Queen of Egypt did. But behind her stands another figure, which is a lioness-headed goddess, and she is also that goddess. And indeed, when you see Sekhmet statues, you are looking in many, many cases at the statue of the goddess Mut. There are hundreds and hundreds of these Sekhmet statues that come from the Mut precinct. All of them were actually made by Amenhotep III in the 18th dynasty. This one is one of the larger examples, and you see on it the goddess with a wreath, a crown of cobra sun discs, and here she is representing the goddess I'm going to talk about now. That is the Eye of Re. Now, as the Eye of Re, Mut was not the wife of Amun-Re, but rather the daughter of the sun god. And as such, she was an agent for the sun god on earth. This meant that she could operate to do what the sun god needed done, which might mean be very good to people. But on the other hand, it might not. It might mean to punish people if they've done something wrong. So her lioness side is actually one of the two temperaments that are expressed in that Mut gateway relief. Now, there are a couple of different myths that are associated with the story of Sekhmet and Mut. And one of them is called the myth of the sun's eye. And in the myth of the sun's eye, the lion goddess leaves and goes to the south, and the concern is that she might not come back, and so she is enticed to come back eventually by the dog ape or baboon that you see represented here on the right. But there's a second myth, and that is the destruction of mankind. And in the story of the destruction of mankind, Re becomes unhappy with people and decides to turn his daughter Hathor into Sekhmet the lion and send her down into Egypt to kill mankind. Soon thereafter, he relents, and the gods help him to relent, and they decide that they must avert this tragedy, and so they fill the entire fields of Upper Egypt with beer that has been pigmented red, so it looks like blood. And by this time, Sekhmet has developed a bloodlust and is running up and down looking for more. So she drinks all of the beer, becomes drunk, falls asleep, and mankind is saved. Well, that is partially a background for at least one of our drunkenness festivals, and so is the story of the myths of the sun's eye. Now here you can see that we have placed the lion by the lake of Mut. The name of our lake is Ishiru, and probably it represents etymologically a place where lions could get water. It's a watering hole, and it would entice the lion to return to her home. And so that's one reason, perhaps, that the Ishiru Lake was deliberately, continually dug to hug the temple itself, so that the lion would actually want to come and be within the temple. So now let's think a little bit more about what we know about festivals of drunkenness in the Temple of Mut. There is actually a calendrical text on one of the front gates, and it mentions all of the major calendrical feasts of the year, and 2 of those are festivals of drunkenness. One is the one that we know also from Dendera, the so-called Feast of Teki, that it happened in the very first month of the year on the 20th day. And that is, Teki means drinking, drunken. So it is the festival of drunkenness that took place there. And a second one took place in much later in the year at the so-called Beautiful Feast of the Valley, one of those festivals, as Emily mentioned, that is quite regional to Thebes itself and was celebrated in the 10th month of the year. And as you see in the quotations from this particular festival, at that time, they indeed dyed the beer red so that it could be dispensed in the Temple of Mut for the celebrants. I'm having, this thing is there. So some years ago, we had to do some dismantling in the temple in order to strengthen the front walls of the porch. And when we did, we actually excavated a room directly behind the porch. And when we did that, we actually found about 1.5 meters down a row of limestone blocks that represent a gate or doorway, and also behind that, a large number of column drums. Here you see them right before we began to remove the column drums. They had been placed in here in the sole reign of Thutmose III, who followed or was co-regent with Hatshepsut and then continued after her disappearance. And he took this porch down that Hatshepsut had put up with the drums and used it to widen the entire temple. The entrance gate showed Hatshepsut on the left-hand side in front of the goddess Mut, and here you see her looking like a beautiful queen. And on the right jamb of this same gate, there was Thutmose III. This was during their period of co-regency. So all the columns have now been put back up, although this is not how they originally stood. We put them this way simply so one would have a sort of entranceway that wasn't just foundation level elevation. But on these particular, on these columns, 6 of them bear a particular inscription that say that she made it as a monument for her mother Mut, making for her a porch of drunkenness anew, meaning that there had been a porch of drunkenness at some point before, but almost certainly would have been made of mud bricks, and Hatshepsut built it out of stone. Now, we know that this festival of drunkenness was being celebrated in Egypt for as early as the Middle Kingdom. It's named on a calendar from that time period. But our actual archaeological evidence for its celebration in temples was confined to the last couple of hundred years before the Common Era until the finding of these columns. So now we know that Hatshepsut, in fact, did celebrate this in the 1470s. And interestingly, when we removed these columns, beneath one of them was a broken drinking bowl of exactly the date. So this is almost certainly the location showing in blue of where the porch with columns of the porch of drunkenness was located in the time of Hatshepsut. Over to the side, this would have been to the west side of her temple. Now, I should point out that it's a small area, right? That is because this particular festival took place all night long, and the porch was the sort of final place in which the goddess's statue was brought to meet up with the people. And now I'm going to walk you through what we know about what happened at one of these drunkenness festivals. So there are a variety of elements that go into the drunkenness festival. It is always associated with lioness goddesses who are the Eye of Re. It involves inebriation from beer or wine to gain an altered state. This is not social drinking, and other substances are contributory to it. It is a communal activity as a ritual, something that is somewhat different from what we might have seen were we to be a priest in the temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, where there is a very different kind of hierarchical expression. This is a true communal activity, although it is moderated by particular people whose role it was to recite, to sing, and to read portions for the people. It will achieve an epiphany of the goddess if it is successful. That is, the celebrants will see the goddess, and that is how they will express it. This will be one of the main reasons why altered substances are used, because that direct experience of the goddess can be guided and can be brought into being. And finally, once an epiphany has happened and the goddess is in direct connection with the communicants, they will then be able to make a communal request of the deity. So we are very fortunate to have at a temple very nearby to Karnak, only 8 kilometers to the north at the temple of Metamud, a hymn that has been inscribed on the walls of the courtyard. And that particular hymn tells us a great deal about the, excuse me for 1 minute, I have to put my glasses on. Okay. So, it's not going to really help me much, is it? Okay. Yes, the hymn is begins by asking people to come to the ceremony, and tells them that the lamps are about to be lit, the people will gather, and they will be in the place of inebriation. And the words that are being used for this identify the place of seeking that the people will also come to find, not in this particular hymn, but in another song. And in this case, what we find is that people are gathering together and being encouraged to come together for the purpose of being inebriated. Oh, now I can actually see it. Yes, you see that it says, the procession is in the place of drunkenness, that hall of traveling through the marshes. And this is the point I want to get to here. Its performance is set, its order is in effect, without anything lacking in it. Now that reminds us that we are talking about a festival in which the big aim is for everyone to become entirely plastered. And yet, it has a clear set of order and a performance that must be followed. And so there's no chance, it's not coincidence, it's not chaos that of just going and getting drunk and that's it. It is very, very much determined. The second part of the hymn tells us all the different members that might be part of this kind of group. So we would have royal children might be there. The king is not mentioned, but the royal children would be present. Now the king has another role, and we'll hear about that in a moment, but we also have the officials, and then we have the lector priest, who is going to actually be intoning a hymn. And then we have the magician, the rechket, the one who knows the ritual. And he is going to actually be the one who recites the full order of the ritual and keeps everyone together focused on their job. Then we have the organizer, and he is then followed by lots and lots of young people, which we'll see in just a moment. And you'll see that one of the things that's mentioned is that they have lotus blooms, and they also mention drummers. And the drummers are going to take up their tambourines during this evening. So we can say that from highest to not all the way lowest, but middle-class artisans could be part of this group. The highest officials, such as Senmut, whom you see here in the middle, and of course, the royalty also takes a part in all of this. Now, it's important to note that the idea of having all altered consciousness and using various substances for a communal ritual is something we see worldwide. And it is always the case, however, that just as we saw in the hymn from Metamud, these are not just simply left to haphazardly let people get plastered, drunk, whatever, on drugs, but rather they are very carefully worked through and brought through as a group. There is a level of suggestion by the various priests who do this that helped everyone to achieve and see the same things together. So one of the ways that this was done in ancient Egypt was by the use of music. Now, music is a very important element in all Egyptian festivals, but bearing in mind that when the Egyptians come together for this, the evening starts as the lamps are lit and people start to drink and people begin as the evening goes on to become more and more drunk. At a certain stage, it is intended that they fall asleep, that they actually do pass out. And so the music itself can be used at the right moment to lull the people into that time when they do, in fact, fall asleep. We see that, for example, I cite here this De Rios and Katz article who worked on the Peruvian Amazon regions. And the shamans said that this is how they did it, that they chose specific music to get elicit very specific responses from the group. So I think in Egypt, we might actually see something that is not entirely different from that. But once the people in Egypt fall asleep, this would be in the early morning hours, a little while later, drummers come in and whack the drums like crazy. And they are awakened at that point, and that is when the moment of experiencing the deity takes place. So the use of music has more than one function in this Egyptian type of ritual. So our hymn continues by talking about, additional people who are part of the participants. And we hear a great deal about female youths who are, in fact, rejoicing with garlands around and giving out garlands, and that's what we see in this tomb painting. And by this, we also see from the tomb of Neferhotep below, at the end of the 18th dynasty, we see the drummers coming back in at that time, and we know that there will be an awakening for these people. So now we might want to just ask ourselves, what did they drink? And I've said already the wine and beer, but I'll get to that in just a moment. The Menamud hymn begins at this point to really emphasize frenetic activity. It talks about the dances of the Libyans and the Nubians, and this is not at all coincidental, but in fact, it's a reminder that the course of our goddess, a sun goddess, is actually from northwest to southeast and back again each day. And so deliberately choosing Libyans and Nubians emphasizes that particular route. As the hymn goes on, the next stage is actually now fantastical. By this time, I think people are deep into the drunkenness. And so they talk about various and sundry animals that represent the wild and chaotic areas to the south of Egypt. And we see this illustrated somewhat illustrated in a famous papyrus from Turin that it's often called the erotic papyrus. It has a combination of images that have to do with fantastic animals at their own drunkenness festival, and then also a series of images of sexual activity, which a number of scholars, and I would agree with them, believe is actually intended to show one of these rituals of drunkenness. Now, we have also become aware that most of what we've learned about these drunkenness festivals has come from songs and from hymns, which is not a surprise because we've seen already how important music is to the festival itself. A series of ostraca and papyri from very late dates have representations of songs that are preserved that are evoking other lion-headed goddesses and a particular kind of ceremony. And the communicants who are there are urged to drink, to eat, and also to have sex. And so sexual activity was, in fact, one of the major offshoots that was in fact encouraged to happen. Now this does mean that in a temple environment, one might come with your husband, but not necessarily go home with them. So we even see this represented not only in the last centuries before the Common Era, but also back in the 18th dynasty. We don't see the sex represented, but we do see, that is on temple or tomb walls, but we do see people drinking to excess. And if you look at that image there, the lower one on the right, you will see a man who's got an entire jug that he's put to his mouth. That's actually the pouring jar, not a cup that he's put. And there's a woman doing the same thing in the upper register. So we get the sense that this is encouragement to get more and more out of control, as it were. Excuse me. In this tomb at El Kab, the tomb of Paheri that dates to the reign of Thutmose III, there is in fact a banquet represented, and we even have conversations going on between the people, the guests at this particular banquet. And the subject is in fact about drinking. So I've translated at the bottom for you some of the exchanges, and what we find is that a couple of the people there have their hand up like this, refusing the drink that the butler is offering to them. And the butler speaks back to them to say, it's okay, you can do this. And one of them also says, don't worry, I'll stay with you. Now this is something that we see also in the ostraca that are from the much, much, much later date, where it says that they will be taken care of by members of the corporation. So they have their designated drivers who aren't going to drink and who will take care of those who are going to. And we see the same thing being spoken between the people here in this early, this would be early in the 15th century. And here's another one of these ostraca. Now here is where we begin to see also one of the goals of this festival. And you see where it says, when they are drunk, they will see the merit goddess by means of the vessel. So it is by means of drinking that they will actually have this epiphany, this opportunity to see directly the goddess. So the way to get there is to drink, to eat, to drink, and sing, and get drunk. And that is encouraged throughout. In the 18th dynasty, flipping back again, we also have an indication of a very similar nature in a song that is on the walls of the tomb of a man named Horemheb. And in that particular instance, it is not seeing Mut, but it is seeing Amun that will be the result of their being together in this, at the festival. And in the end, we see that Mut has come as the faraway one, the one who is the one who leaves and we entice to come back, of the beautiful face, in order to cause her sistrum players to cry out, desiring drunkenness from a goblet of gold. So again, it is by means of the drinking goblet or the drinking vessel that they are able to achieve this epiphany with their goddess. So the question then I said too early on is, what might they be actually consuming? In their beer, we know from Dendera, the temple of the goddess Hathor, that there were numerous herbs that were added to the wine or to the beer, and also other substances that may or may not have been possibly laudanum and other soporific herbs. All of the ones that one can actually pin down at all tend to be sleep-inducing. I've not found anything that suggests hallucinatory effects. But clearly the aim was for everyone to become very, very drunk, but also excuse me, but also the result of that is with all these additives, people begin to get sick in their stomach and we begin to see vomiting. So we have a number of instances that are represented just as you see that. We also know that they did have these tiny little jars that almost certainly contained concentrated oils of various particular substances that again would have made falling asleep much easier, because that really was a major aim for the evening. So beer was very important, and the Egyptians called that the menu beer. It was oftentimes dyed red in certain, at the Feast of the Valley or at other cases in the temples. But in the tombs where they were celebrating the Feast of the Valley, wine was the primary material that they drank, and the wine too would have had additives in it. And it's important to note that the additives were almost certainly a key element to bring about the sleep for the communicants late in the evening, because beer and wine are really not excellent means of bringing along people at exactly the same moment that you want it to happen. People will get drunk, but they will get drunk at different times. So having the additives allowed the people running the festival to more or less focus people on when they should fall asleep. Now, let me very quickly say that getting drunk in Egyptian society was hardly something that was approved. It was, in fact, very much looked down upon. Certain literary texts that we call instructions, actually of the New Kingdom period, talk about how embarrassing it is and that people will really ignore you if you are drunk and fall down around them. So, in fact, the fact that drunkenness became part of a religious ritual certainly meant that it meant something completely different to the people who chose to follow it. And we see in a number of instances that you've already seen the people in the tomb of Paheri with their hands up rejecting the drinking. And this is something that we see later on is even more strongly considered, that there were many, many people who were very opposed to this kind of behavior. So in the tomb of Rekhmire, the vizier under Thutmose III, there's actually a scene as part of the banquet in which the people being served are asking a question. Out loud, they ask, "Is it mot, is it correct, in her sight, desiring drunkenness?" And many years ago, Henry Fisher of this institution wrote that in his reversal of hieroglyphs, that they reversed the name of the goddess Ma'at, which is right in the center. Let me see if I know how to do this. Here, see that? That has been reversed in such that it faces the women who have asked this question. And as Fisher said, it was an automatic way to say, yes, it is correct. So when you are actually at a drunkenness festival, it was correct to desire drunkenness. But we must ask this question for the constant fact that there were critics of this. There were people who rejected it, even though you might have Rekmi Ray saying, no, it's okay. We don't really know exactly why. We don't know whether it was the intensity of the drunkenness. We don't know whether it was the fact that it made people vomit, and that's not very pleasant. Or was it the sexual activity that was being encouraged? But there are, in fact, very late texts that reflect that there was an intense debate going on, and in fact, people were almost angry at one another. They rejected people because they held the viewpoint that drunkenness was something good to do, and then there were the ones who thought, no, not. So I have here a quote from yet another one of these songs, and it says, "As for those who have called me evil, Moot will call them evil." So we begin to see repetitions of text like this, where Moot is almost moved into a position in the last centuries before the Common Era of being an exclusive cult of her own, that people who were her adherents were perhaps not liked by a lot of other people, or at least were considered suspicious. And in this same time, people had developed an interest in having religious associations. We have them already in the New Kingdom, but by the late period, they are what people did for their own form of worship. They joined a religious association for a very specific deity, and there's some evidence to suggest that they then were encouraged to be exclusive. So I go to Moot, I'm entrusted to Moot, nobody else. And so in this instance, that would have intensified the sort of separation that people might have felt. And yet, we have to say that this particular type of festival endured for 2,000 years. And we continue through time to see statues and stelae and all sorts of other objects dedicated as monuments by people bragging about their drunkenness, about their going through the marshes. Going through the marshes is oftentimes considered to be a sexual innuendo, and we still don't know with certainty that that's what it meant, but there certainly has been strong argument in that direction. And the sexuality was something that we can actually attest to. In the New Kingdom, there are a number of graffiti and ostraca that were left in tombs and elsewhere that represent what people did during the Feast of the Valley when they crossed the river together with the statue of Amun and the statue of Mut, etc., at the beautiful Feast of the Valley. They then went to their ancestors' tombs and celebrated. And these objects that show the sexual act were found in private tombs, the one on the upper left in the tomb of the second priest of Amun, Puyemre. So we can be fairly sure that this activity happened during the beautiful feast and also during the festival of drunkenness itself. But we also note that there's a great emphasis on these images that have come down to us on the people being represented, the females being represented, were musicians. Now, it's not really clear, but perhaps we must ask the question whether the fact that it is musicians, on the one hand, obviously they are part of the festival, so of course they will be included, but they also were women who were perhaps of a slightly lower status than an elite woman, and that may be one reason why they are fair game for all of this imagery. Now, I mentioned this Turin papyrus earlier. This is a drawing of it. The papyrus itself is highly fragmentary and really would not come across for you. But we know that that the sexual behavior was rampant during this time period, and we have to consider that, given this fact, there may very well have been a considerable number of children that resulted from these festivals. And that would have had some strain, perhaps, on the societal norms. And we know of at least one case that looks as if the person actually was the issue of this particular type of lovemaking during the beautiful Feast of the Valley. On the stela of a man named Kenhir Kepeshef, he says that he was conceived down by Deir el-Bahri, near the temple of Amenhotep I. And this would have been during the actual beautiful feast, which ended up at the Hathor Chapel at Deir el-Bahri. Now, the last thing on our list were the communal requests of the deity. And we have two major types of requests that we know from Dendera, where where Hathor's temple was located. And these do seem to be standard types of requests when we can actually find references to the requests. So one of them is that it might bring joy for the goddess and for the king and for the people. And in that first one, it's addressing O Golden. Golden is the nickname for Hathor herself, the beautiful sun goddess. And it says, his abomination, that is the king's abomination, is the sadness of your face. His abomination is the sadness of the female sun disk. So in this case, in that royal context of a major temple, we have the king concerned for the goddess and the king acting for the goddess. Now, a second type of request would be also in a royal context to actually save the king. And here we see how beautiful is what your Horus creates for you. May you save the king of Upper and Lower Egypt from every evil thing of this day. So there's a great concern on the one hand for making the goddess and the king happy, but there's also a great concern of saving the king from any kind of threat that may have come, because the king is the one who also acts on behalf of the gods, so he cannot be harmed. Now, when it comes to people rather than the common or more common people, the requests are to save them. And we see that on the papyri from Florence that date to the late Ptolemaic era. And it says, may she cause my heart to see full of joy. Mut, make for me protection from those against me. Mut is my protection, for I am entrusted to Mut. So this particular type is to be saved for the people, and they ask the goddess to be their protection. So it's the same type of request, but translated to the people who are her adherents. Now, interestingly, there is, in fact, a similar kind of request found on a statue of the reign of Hatshepsut from the Mut Temple. And on this statue, on the back of this statue, is a hymn, the hymn we call the Hymn to the Uraeus, because it invokes different forms of the Uraeus goddesses. But it is almost certainly written as a telling of what happens when the goddess Sekhmet is awakened in order to do the bidding at the time of the request in the drunkenness festival. So first, it urges the goddess to awaken, and then it tells us that she's being awakened peaceful, but then she is being set to work in a very violent manner. May the pestilence which is upon your mouth and the slaughter which is on your lips awaken. And sends her out to do as Re had done, to kill mankind. But then it says the real request on this that Hapu-Seneb, the high priest of Amun, has dedicated. He adds this to already well-established hymn that he's just quoted. May you judge this matter which the king of Upper Egypt, Mot-Ka-Re, has spoken to you. O Sekhmet, may you be powerful of heart, be powerful indeed over those who hate her. So once again, it is save the ruler. That is the request. And then it ends with, may your face be kind to the one who adores your beauty. So we have these two sides always. So always be kind to us because we are your adherents. We follow you, but we also need you to act violently to save the king and perhaps to save us as well. Now, this particular role was also played by the king in a very formalized way in the temple at a particular ceremony that was part of the drunkenness festival. It's called striking the ball, Seker Hemat, and the king actually sort of takes a baseball bat and a ball and whacks it. The ball is actually representing the pupil of the eye and of the enemies, and he strikes it to go to the 4 cardinal points away to save the goddess. And so this is the sort of monumentalization on the wall of what the role of the king is in carrying out that request to save the goddess. So in conclusion, the Festival of Drunkenness at the Mut Temple embraced risky, very risky behavior approaching chaos. This is something that was important to them, that it not just be social drinking, they had to risk it all for it to be meaningful. Through the altered consciousness in order that the participants might see the goddess and participate in her role as the Eye of Re, the agent of the sun god. So while seeing the goddess directly to ensure her protection was one goal, another was the punishment of the sun god's enemies, who surface as the enemies of various congregations or religious associations. Whoops. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to move on to our last presentation by Foy Scaff. And I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Foy's background before we get into the lecture. He is a scholar of ancient Egyptian religion, texts, and intellectual culture, whose work has implications for the collections in museums, libraries, and digital humanities. He is a research associate and the director of the Data Research Center and Research Archives Library at the University of Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. He received his PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago, and his research focuses on ancient Egyptian religious literature, book culture, and textual transmission, especially in the periods of the New Kingdom. Especially in the periods following the New Kingdom. He has published widely on these subjects and has worked extensively on the interpretation, curation, and digital presentation of Egyptian manuscripts. In 2017, he curated the exhibition Book of the Dead, Becoming God in Ancient Egypt, and edited its acclaimed catalog, which brought new attention to the materiality and meaning of funerary manuscripts at the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. His forthcoming book, The Getty Book of the Dead, Ancient Egyptian Manuscripts in the J. Paul Getty Museum, will offer the first complete critical edition, both in print and digital formats, of one of the largest collections of Egyptian religious texts in North America. Across his work, he is committed to rethinking how the ancient Egyptian literature is studied, preserved, and made accessible, from traditional philology to emerging digital methods. Today, he brings that perspective to the Festival of Khohak and the Mysteries of Osiris. It is my pleasure to invite Foy to come up and give his presentation, A Festival to Re-Member, Celebrating the Mysteries of Osiris in Ancient Egypt. Foy?
Thank you very much. First, I would like to congratulate everybody here at the Met and the Egyptian Art Department for a spectacular exhibit, one of the best and biggest collections of artifacts related to ancient Egyptian deities that I've ever seen in the world outside of Egypt. And I also would encourage you to see the exhibit if you haven't yet and spend some time there or to revisit it. I'd also like to thank the Met for inviting me to be part of this symposium and talk to you today about the Festival of Khoiak. Which in ancient Egypt really was a festival to remember. Yes, I'm using a pun there. And I want to thank Betsy, actually. When I first put this title slide together, I thought maybe it was a little much to say remember and show Osiris's member as part of the body parts in the scene. But after seeing Betsy's talk on the Festival of Drunkenness and the sexual exploits there, this is perfectly pedestrian. So thank you, Betsy, for laying the groundwork for me. So this Festival of Khoiak, unlike some of the festivals that we've heard about already tonight, was one of the most universal and widespread celebrated festivals in ancient Egypt. From the very north of Egypt all the way to the very south, for thousands of years, we have attestations and information about this festival. Now, the festival's name, Khoiak, it derives from the name of the Egyptian month in which the festival occurs. And in fact, it occurs pretty much throughout that entire month. There's weeks of ritual celebrations that we'll talk about here soon that occur during this month. So it's called the Festival of Khoiak after that name of the month, which we'll talk more about. The main purpose of the Khoiak Festival was a performative celebration about the coming agricultural crop. So I'll show you here in a minute that this occurs at a point in the Egyptian year when they were anticipating the planting of the seeds and growing the grain. So they would have this ritual, this set of rituals, this month-long celebration, specifically to make sure that that crop would come about, to celebrate the coming fertility of the land. And they celebrated this every year in this month of Koyak. As I mentioned, it was celebrated throughout the ancient Egyptian countryside and involved, and this is, I hope it's clear to you from the other speakers today, one of the things that we're focusing on is how much the entire ancient Egyptian community was involved. This isn't just about priests, it's not just about kings, it's not just about priestesses, and it's actually not just about gods. This is about the ancient Egyptian people and them coming together around their various beliefs. Now, the primary rituals that were involved in this Koyak festival all revolved around what we usually call the mysteries of Osiris. We'll talk about those specifically throughout this talk, but what this really focused on was the rejuvenation of the god as a symbol of the potential fertility of the land. So this is an overview of the Koyak festival that you can sort of keep in mind for the rest of my presentation here. This is the background to the entire ritual and to the entire festival. Now, Koyak was one of the months in what's often called the civil calendar in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, there was a number of ways that they divided up the time throughout the year. One of these was the civil calendar. I'll explain more about that in just a minute, but that civil calendar was actually based on the 365 days of the solar calendar. And in fact, our 365-day calendar goes back to this ancient Egyptian civil calendar based on the solar year. But there were also a lunar calendar in ancient Egypt. That is, they also scheduled festivals, rituals, broke up parts of the year according to the lunar cycle, both in sidereal and synodic phases, so that is the different phases of the moon, either relative to its position between the sun and earth, or the position of the moon between the earth and the background stars. And then there were other ways that they broke up the time, like a fiscal calendar, sort of the same way that we have fiscal calendars that might run from, let's say, July 1st to June 30th. They also had calendars based on when the state would collect its taxes. For tonight, what we're mostly focused on then is that civil calendar and the month of Koyak that's within that calendar. Now, the ancient Egyptian year, as you heard from Emily earlier, was broken up into various periods. A week in ancient Egypt was 10 days long, and Emily was mentioning earlier that decade feast that happened once every 10 days that was very much focused on the ancestors of ancient individual families. So a week was 10 days. Each month had 3 weeks in it, so you had 30 days per month. They broke that up into 12 months for the year, so you had 360 days from those 36 weeks. And then they added 5 days at the end of the calendar, often birthdays of the gods. So for example, the birthday of Re, the birthday of Osiris, that was added on at the end to give them the 365-day civil calendar. Now you'll notice that this is only 365. We're missing that quarter day, and we keep our calendar in sync with the solar year through those leap years, adding an extra day in February. The ancient Egyptians did not have those leap years, so this calendar, the civil calendar, wandered as compared to the natural progression of the seasons. So for example, the first day of the year would change by 0.25 of a day every year, and so the cycle would last 1,460 years, and we call that a Sothic cycle, and we can explain more about that. But this is just to explain to you the Egyptian calendar. So that year was broken up into a series of seasons based on the agricultural cycle. The first season was called Akhet, and we often translate that as inundation. Inundation meaning this is the time when the Nile flood came down from the highlands of Ethiopia, and the country for the first few months of the year would be flooded. And it's at this time that, number one, the ancient Egyptians started building canals, dams, and dikes because they wanted to control that flood water. They didn't want to just let it all rush out into the Mediterranean Sea. They wanted to use it to water their crops in the coming season. And so it's in this season, Akhet, that we find the month of Koyak, as we'll talk about shortly. The other seasons are Peret, so the season after the inundation season was the seeding or the growing season. This is when you plant and you let your grain grow. And then you had the Shimu season or the harvest season. So these are the three seasons that broke up the ancient Egyptian year. And it was in the fourth month of that inundation season when we get the month of Koyak. So the importance of this calendrical place of this celebration, notice it comes at the end of that inundation season. It comes at the end of the period when the flood's receding and they're starting to do the agricultural work of planting the crops. This will become important as we see some of the rituals that they do as part of that Koyak festival. Now, the name itself, this name Koyak, it derives from this ancient Egyptian phrase, ka her ka, and we could translate it something like spirit on spirit, and we have it also in Coptic as Koyak. So this is when the celebration occurs in this period of the year, the fourth month of the Akhit season, that first inundation season. Now, Koyak, as a festival, has everything to do with this particular god who you see on the screen in three different objects that are all upstairs in the Divine Egypt exhibit right now, and that is the god Osiris. And everything in the Koyak festival and the Osiris mysteries really revolve around the mythology surrounding this god Osiris. The main elements of that are that in a contestation for the rulership of Egypt, Osiris is murdered by his brother Seth, and they cut his body parts up and spread them throughout Egypt. And we see here from a papyrus in the Louvre Museum, you can see the depiction of those body parts here at the bottom, where we see the various body parts that are cut off. And I just want to say briefly before we move on that these body parts then became relics in temples all throughout Egypt. So temples of various sites would have reproductions of some of these body parts of Osiris in the same way that like a medieval monastery might have the divine relics of a monk. So we can see the various parts here, including at the bottom of the screen, the member that we will be remembering as part of this larger festival. And these body parts were then gathered up by a number of gods. This includes Isis, Nephthys, and of course also gods like Anubis and here Thoth. And these body parts were initially gathered up into an animal skin. That's what you see on the left side of your screen. The body parts put inside this animal skin and hung on a pole. That whole symbol becomes a worshipped fetish of its own in ancient Egypt that we usually call the Emiut fetish, Emiut meaning that which is inside the wrapping. So this is a reference to these gathered body parts of Osiris before he has been embalmed and reawakened or rejuvenated from the state of death. Further along in that same papyrus from the Louvre, we can actually see that embalming process here. You can see Anubis putting those pieces back together and wrapping them up in linen. And I just should pause for a second to say this is the mythological precedent for mummification in ancient Egypt. All the ancient Egyptian individuals who were having their bodies mummified after death were doing so to mimic Osiris, because we should also keep in mind that when you're walking through that gallery upstairs of Divine Egypt, that these gods often represented personifications of forces of nature. Okay, so for the ancient Egyptians to talk about, let's say, abstract theology about how the cosmos worked, it made it easier for them to personify those forces and give them a name. So for example, Osiris personifies the force of rejuvenation, the ability to come back from death. So, for example, if the sun god is going to raise the next morning in the horizon, it has to go through Osiris at night. And if you want to exist in a spiritual state after death, you too need to go through Osiris. And we should point out too, I was talking with one of the curators in the exhibit today about this, Osiris really isn't resurrected. When Osiris is rejuvenated, he stays in the spiritual world, this world that the Egyptians called the Duat. We often translate that sometimes as something like neither world, but I think you might just think of it as the afterlife. And Osiris stays there as the god of the dead after he is rejuvenated through this process of A, being brought together and wrapped up in linen bandages, right, that is being embalmed, turned into a mummy, and then also through the magical recitations of the goddess Isis. So this mythology and this mythological precedent is at the center of what they're celebrating when we're looking at the Koyak festivities. Now I'd like to pause and take a little bit of a tangent What you see here is a mosaic on the screen of a wall from the Temple of Philae in the south of Egypt, and you see a number of these scenes related to these mysteries of Osiris, this Khoiak festival. And in particular, I'll point out now, we'll come back to this. If you look in the bottom center of the screen, you see a priest pouring water over top of a mummy and plants growing out of it. This will be a central piece of the Khoiak festivities, but what I want to pause on here is not that piece yet. I want to continue with thinking about the body parts of Osiris, and I want you to look in the center of the screen where we have two goddesses and this. Here's the actual image of the wall if you'd like to see what it looks like. Doesn't look like too much here in the drawing. And there's a text that's associated with this. There's a hieroglyphic text right above it, and this is what it says. As for the great mourner, she traveled upstream to the sacred mound. She entered this spiritual world. That's that word duat. She quickly found Osiris's thighs. She had a great wailing to Heliopolis. She opened her heart to Re. Look, Re did whatever she said she wanted. How happy was Isis the Great, the mother of the god? Ra-Harakti chose his words. He sent orders to all the cities and all the districts in Upper and Lower Egypt, and this was the order. Come on, let Osiris renew his life through a great burial so that he may pour out for you the flood to the cities, the one who provides all that is needed. So what you see here is Osiris's thighs gathered by the goddesses here, and it's those thighs that are the origin of the Nile flood. Okay. We even see this preserved in Greco-Roman writers like Plutarch, who says, just as they view the Nile as the efflux of Osiris, thus they hold the earth to be the body of Isis, and so forth. So in some of these myths, it's Osiris himself who is the origin of the Nile, and not just himself, but his decaying body, his efflux, right, because he's been killed by his brother Seth, that emerges from his body. And this term for efflux, this term in ancient Egyptian, reju, becomes a theologically significant term invoked all over the place and in many different texts. Here's one example of this. Raise yourself, O eldest of the flood, Osiris who came forth at the beginning and fills the earth with his efflux. Now, at first glance, you might think that this sounds unusual to our modern ears, but keep in mind that the Nile flood, when it was coming down from those Ethiopian highlands, was filled with fertile black dirt, right? It was filled with compost, decomposing matter, which is exactly what Osiris is turning into. So this is, again, the ancient Egyptians looking at their natural environment and coming up with explanations for what they see happening in their world. And in certain texts, it can be even more specific, like we have here. You have your water, you have your inundation, the efflux that comes from the god, the decay that comes from Osiris. So when we're looking at these scenes of the mysteries of the Osiris and the Khoiak festival, and scenes like this, where you have two goddesses gathering up the thighs of Osiris, we're looking at their explanation for the origin of the flood. Now, if I can beg my pardon of my Egyptology colleagues here in the room for letting me give a pet theory of my own for you. This particular text, I think, might actually reveal something about another ancient Egyptian god that we know very little about. If we take this out and look at Osiris's thighs, it looks quite similar to a god that's often called Medjed. You see Medjed here, the two eyes on this shrouded figure. Many people refer to it like Medjed that looks like a ghost. But actually, as you can see, this is the bottom of a kilt and the bottom half of a human being with their feet sticking out of the bottom. We have a number of images of Medjed. Here you can see at the top where he's wearing a little belt slashed around his kilt. And what we find when we translate the text that we know about Medjed, he appears in the Book of the Dead in spell number 17. This is what it says. I know the name of this Medjed. Where is Medjed? Who is among those inside of the temple of Osiris, who shoots with his eye, but he cannot be seen, who circles heaven with flames of his mouth. Here's the important part. Who announces the flood, but he cannot be seen. So Medjed, this guy, this deity, whom many people identify in different ways, is the bottom part of an individual, I think the thighs of Osiris. He's in the temple of Osiris, and he announces the flood. So I think actually Medjed is probably the personification of the origin of the flood in Osiris's body. But as maybe some of the younger members of the crowd might know, that Medjed has gone on to become an internet meme now, and you can see that because he, quote unquote, shoots fire from his eyes in the text, he's now shooting laser beams and spitting fire out of his mouth. And I would just encourage the Met to very soon make some Medjed plushies and put them in your Divine Egypt store. I think you'll have a bestseller on your hands. My home institution has so far refused to do so. So that's just a little bit of a tangent to say that throughout the Egyptian countryside and in all these temples, the body parts of Osiris, the myth of Osiris is being practiced and being maintained, and many of these temples had those body parts as relics. At the end of that Osiris myth, of course, the main business is that he defeats Seth, right? So Seth, who dismembered him and threw him into the Nile River, and he is brought back to life again through the embalming of Anubis and the recitations of the goddess Isis, his sister. And here from that same papyrus again, we see the triumphant Osiris over top of Seth, Seth here with the head of a donkey turned upside down in a mound and written in red to symbolize his sort of chaotic evilness in this particular circumstance. And we see this throughout a number of other texts and reliefs in ancient Egypt. For example, here from some of these temple walls, like at Dendera. We'll come back to the Dendera temple that Betsy mentioned many times about the wandering goddess. But here you can see a bull that's been chained up by Isis and Nephthys, and this is actually a bull associated with Seth. And you can see on the left side that the bull is being slaughtered and the pieces of the bull are being taken apart. Or another famous scene here also from Dendera, where Horus is stabbing Seth, who is tied to a stick in front of Osiris. So at the end of the myth, Osiris is brought back, restored to kingship as the king of the dead in the Duat, in the afterlife, or in the spiritual world. And so that is sort of the key part of these myths. Now, one thing that I want you to keep in mind, and that I think is really important, and is mentioned by the previous speakers already, is that these rituals and these celebrations involved the ancient Egyptian people. And so not only are they doing this in their mummification practices for everyone who gets buried in ancient Egypt, but all of the community who's coming around and participating in this animation that the Getty Museum made a number of years ago for an exhibit that they had, sort of was trying to emphasize that community participation, right? The family members of the deceased, the priests who were involved, this larger community who come together to celebrate and to practice these individual rituals. And this is also true of these Koyak festivities, since the Festival of Koyak is largely imitating these various rites that are associated with the mythology of Osiris, right? So putting him back together, mummification, and bringing him back to a kind of life in the other world. So one of these types of participants are people like this. This is from a papyrus that gives us a bit of the overview of this Koyak festivities. It gives us some of the rites and actions that are involved. And what we have here is the words which the scribe of the Book of God made in the month of Koyak. And then we go on to get descriptions of some of the individual practices that we have throughout the month. And some of those practices might look like this, again, on a relief from the Temple of Dendera that we'll look at in a minute, but I'm showing it to you here just to show you again some of the activities and people who were involved. In this case, mostly ritual practitioners, different types of priests, making offerings before individual statues representing different forms of the god Osiris. But if we look at this in a bigger communal aspect, we could see this in a similar vein here, where we have not just the priest who's reading from the scroll and a separate set of priests who are offering incense, but then also the mourners who are standing in front of their deceased relatives, or perhaps in a more emotional version here from a papyrus in the British Museum, showing this group of female mourners who are mourning. Now, we have texts that describe this in much more detail, some of these participants, texts like this, again from the British Museum, where we have here at the beginning the songs of Isis and Nephthys, and we have this description of some of these participants in this. Beginning of the stanzas of the Festival of the Two Kites, performed in the Temple of Osiris, foremost of the West, great God, Lord of Abydos. Notice the date from Koyak 22, that is day 22 to day 26. The entire temple is to be sanctified. 2 women with pure limbs who have not opened, that is, who have not given birth, are brought in. The hair of their body is removed, their heads adorned with wigs, tambourines in their hands, and listen to this part, write the names upon their shoulders as Isis and Nephthys. They will sing from the stanzas of this book before this god. So as part of the Koyak festivities in the month of Koyak, we're bringing in women, we are branding them or writing on their arms the names of Isis and Nephthys so they can play those ritual roles as part of this larger celebration. So again, this is just to reemphasize this point that this is a larger communal celebration that involves the people from all levels of Egyptian society. These types of texts, beyond just, let's say, texts that tell us exactly what happens during these Koyak festivities, we have a whole series of these religious compositions, like the one that you just saw. In the introduction, it told you where these were from. It was made, let's just go back for 1 second, it was made in the Temple of Osiris, and then these ritual texts were then appropriated and used for individuals as part of their own religious literature that they took with them into the burial, so very much like Book of the Dead manuscripts that you probably know a lot about. So here are a couple of these compositions that we know. In the text, the date on which those compositions were performed, and you can see here Koyak days 22 and 26 for the songs of Isis and Nephthys, 23 through 25 for the glorifications, the lamentations on Koyak 25, and the great decree on Koyak 26. So just to give you a flavor of some of this, this is from the glorifications, the ceremony of glorifying Osiris in the God's domain, which is performed in the temple of Osiris, foremost of the west, the great God, Lord of Abydos, in every festival of Osiris, and all of his appearances in the land performed in the temples likewise. Reciting this is what they do for Osiris from the 23rd of the month of Koyak until the 24th and up to the 25th. So what we're getting here then is you can see, and the date here is highlighted. Also, you can see this papyrus up in the gallery outside here, just outside the doors. But we can see here some of the rituals that are being performed in this month of Koyak, and it goes on to tell us more about what they're doing. However, the best evidence and the best set of texts that we have about the Koyak mysteries comes from this room. This is the roof of that temple of Dendera, the temple of Hathor that Betsy talked so much about just a moment ago. This is a chapel on the roof that's dedicated to Osiris. And inside this chapel, we get some of the most elaborate text that we have about these festivities, in addition to one of the most famous texts from ancient Egypt, that is the zodiac that was on the ceiling, which is now in the Louvre. It's been replaced by a cast that's there. And one reason I wanted to bring this up and show it to you is just to say that even Osiris and his festivities are baked into this astronomical depiction, because what you see in the center, that leg, that is that leg of the bull Seth that you saw earlier who was chained up. And next to the leg in yellow is the goddess Taweret. Now, these two constellations, the reason that they're in the center is that they never dip below the horizon. They stay in the northern sky for the ancient Egyptians. And so they saw Taweret as holding the leg of Seth into the center of the sky so that it could not harm Osiris, who is shown as a standing king at the bottom of the disk as the constellation Orion. And because Orion dipped under the horizon at various points of the year, Taweret's job in this particular zodiac was to hold back that leg of Seth so that it could not injure Osiris. So even this zodiac ceiling that's in this room is connected to these Koyak festivals. This is one of the main walls that, as you can see, shows us many of the different forms of Osiris and the various parts of the Koyak festivities. In the bottom center, what you can see here is actually the shrine of Osiris. Might be a little bit clearer here in a drawing with Isis and Nephthys in a group of 4, so they're standing at all the cardinal directions of the shrine of Osiris. We actually have physical examples of this from earlier periods. This is a cult statue of Osiris on his funerary bed with Isis as a bird of prey on top, conceiving Horus in this particular case. And you can see in the background of this particular image from the Sunken Cities exhibit that went around a number of years ago, the drawing from Dendera that shows this very action happening. So we actually have the 3D cult statues that was used in these types of celebrations. Now, at the center of these mysteries of Osiris, especially in these depictions, we have depictions like I showed you before. Here, the priest pouring water over a mummified form. This is Osiris lying on his bier, and you can see that there are plants growing up from him. And this is one of the central pieces of the Koyak festival, and that is making what we often call a corn Osiris, or sometimes an Osiris vegetans. That is a plant Osiris that is going to grow very much like we could call it Chia Osiris, right? So we're growing plants right out of Osiris. And we have also an image of this from that same Louvre papyrus that I showed before. So here you can see the plants growing up out of Osiris, and what we have on the text right above Osiris here, remember that theological term we had before, the efflux will come forth from the divine limbs of Osiris into this district. It will be called Temple of the Efflux because of it. It will be done likewise at the time of the Tilling the Ground festival. Grain is placed in water and put inside a frame with soil under it and over it. Give water to it every day so that it grows. Perfume is inside it. Wrap all together, perform for it all the rituals of the Tilling of the Ground festival exactly according to the ritual. So again, here in this mystery of the mysteries of Osiris, we see Osiris as the origin of the fertility of Egypt and the fertility of the coming crop, of course, on which the ancient Egyptians depended. And this was shown in other symbolized forms like this, where the shrine of Osiris itself is growing the plants directly out of the shrine, out of the decaying flesh of Osiris. Aside from those symbols, the ancient Egyptians actually did then, if you go up to the galleries, you can see, make Chia Osiris. They made these molds, they filled them with dirt and grain and incense and perfume, and then they would water them until they grew, and there was a whole multi-week series of rituals dedicated to making, sacralizing, burying these figures every year, including the figures from last year. So in one year they would make a figure, the grain would grow out of it, it would symbolize the coming crop, they would leave that, the next year they would bury it when they made the new figure in the next year. And so here are some examples from this Dendera text where we see exactly what's going on from one day to the next. So on Koyak day 15, they're making the coffins. A sycamore coffin is made to hold the figure of Osiris Sokar from the previous year's celebration. A temporary coffin is built of cedar to house the new figure of Osiris Sokar that will soon be created. Koyak day 21, you're going to dry out the Osiris vegetans, or Chia Osiris. The Osiris vegetans covered in sprouting barley is removed from its mold. The two halves are assembled, glued together, and bound by 4 papyrus bands. The now complete figure was dried in the sun throughout the day and then wrapped in linen bands, right? So again, they're treating these corn Osiris figures, these Osiris vegetans, as Osiris. They're mummifying them, putting them in a coffin, and burying them. Koyak day 22, there's a great navigation. Osiris figures are presented to the public, right, to this greater community who would be celebrating before being placed with statues of the other gods on 34 papyrus boats. As the boats float across the sacred waters, the public prays, sings, and offers sacrifices while priests act out scenes of Osiris's death. At the end of the voyage, the divine figures are wrapped in linen and returned to the mysterious temple. And I just want to point out here, we'll come back to this in just a minute, the bronze boats that you see on the top left are from some of the most spectacular discoveries that have been made in Egypt in the last 25 or 30 years in a region off the northern coast, where these boats, which were made for this festival, were then thrown into the river in great numbers by the thousands as part of a votive offering back to the god Osiris. And we'll look more at those excavations and finds in just a minute, but this is just to give you a sense of what's going on day to day in these festivals. Koyak day 23, also from the galleries here, the decoration of Osiris Sokar. On this day, the figure of Osiris Sokar is placed on his pedestal. Precious stones are inlaid for his eyes. His face is painted in gold and yellow, etc. The figure is then coated in an ointment, wrapped in a shroud, and accompanied by 14 amulets. And finally, near the end of the festival, the newly created figures of Osiris vegetans and Osiris Sokar are carried to the center of the temple where they will rest for a year, right? So then they will stay there for a year and they will be buried in the following year. And at the end of this, again, it's about the rejuvenation of the god Osiris. So at the end Day 30, the final day of that Koyak festival, you get the final burial of the figures made from the previous year, and then the Djed pillar was raised. Now, the raising of the Djed pillar is a very important and symbolic ritual representing the re-raising, the rejuvenation of the god Osiris. So this is really the sort of culmination of the Koyak mysteries, making those Osiris figures, bringing the new ones into life by watering them and having the plants grow out of them, burying the ones from last year, and then symbolically raising Osiris up from the dead, which is what you see here in this drawing, again from those Dendera reliefs, Osiris getting up off of his funerary bier. And we have lots of textual references in text throughout ancient Egypt. For example, Book of the Dead spell 170, O Osiris Nefer-Webenef, I have given to you your flesh, as I have attached together your bones, so have I assembled for you your limbs. Shake away the dirt from your flesh. You are Horus in your egg. Raise yourself so that the gods may see. And I just wanted to also throw in that you have this very scene on a very famous set of mummified remains here in the Met. Here's another part from Book of the Dead spell 170 about this. Anubis, who is on his mountain, raises you. He did this for Osiris on that night of crossing over to life. Raise yourself on your bed that you may go out. And if any of you who have spent time here will recognize this scene from Artemidora here in the gallery, where you see again Osiris, this case with the falcon head as Osiris Sokar, getting up off of his funerary bier as part of the sort of final culminating rituals of the Osiris mysteries. And in this case, what we're talking about today, the Koyak festival. Now, I wanted to point out that as we've seen, Osiris is, on the one hand, thought to be, or his efflux is the source of the Nile flood. And in his resurrection as part of the Koyak festivals, he can even be envisioned as a great flood. So what you see here is one of these cult statues, and if you look at it from the side, you can see Osiris is actually painted with waves of water on this. And we can connect this with those Koyak festivities and some of the most recent excavations that have been going on, again, off the coast in Kite Bay in northern Egypt at sites like Canopus and Heraklion, where Frank Godio and his team have discovered in underwater archaeology a number of absolutely spectacular discoveries that illuminate some of these practices. Some of which, by the way, are noted on pieces like this in your collection, this shroud, which has a text related to the bringing out of Osiris Sokar from his shrine. This text is also found on an object like this. And this one is actually one that was found in the waters off the coast of northern Egypt, but there's one that's in Cairo that has inscriptions on it that is parallel with this one, this linen shroud that you guys have here in the Met, and they describe parts of these mysteries. Now I want to describe what this basin is for. You'll see at the bottom that there's a hole in these basins. This is where you put your Chia Osiris, your Osiris vegetans, when you watered them. So you would put these bundles of earth and seeds into these basins, and then you would water them during this period before the grain was growing. But think about, from the Egyptian point of view, what that soil and that water meant. These were sacred parts of the body of the god. They weren't just water and dirt. And so all of this became sacred material. So on the one hand, the ladles that you used, which again were found in great numbers off the coast of northern Egypt there by Frank Godio and his team, these became sacred items that then were given back, again, thrown back into the waters as votive items to offer back to Osiris. But the other thing that happened, if we go back and look at this, as you can imagine, as you're watering your Osiris figures that are in this container, the extra water is running out, and that water would have been collected in jars like this. And these jars are called Osiris Canopus. So Osiris from the city of Canopus. Now, not to go on too much of a tangent because we don't have a lot of time left today, but it's just to say that what you call canopic jars and what I call canopic jars when you see in your gallery is a misnomer, because back in the 19th century, when early Egyptologists saw the jars with different heads, one of which included a human head, they called them canopic jars, after these jars which held the ritual water from the watering of these Osiris figures. So the canopic jars, that name, canopic jar, is a misnomer because it was named after this city of Canopus, and actually canopic jars have nothing to do with the larger Osiris Canopus, or when I say nothing, I should say limited. So these jars then held this sacred water that you would gather from watering these Osiris figures, and they were placed in here and then treated as, again, a holy relic, like the other limbs of Osiris. And in fact, they were such a holy relic that you were not allowed to touch it with your bare hands. This is from a statue of an Isis priest that was again found in Kite Bay off the coast of Egypt by Frank Goddio and his team. And we have a number of these types of images of these priests. Notice that he's using his shroud to touch the Osiris Canopus, because you don't want to touch it with your hands and defile it. This is sacred, divine flesh. This is the divine efflux from Osiris. And this type of practice, this type of imagery, the Koyak festivities made it all the way to Herculaneum, where you see frescoes like this of Isis priests holding the Osiris Canopus, the water of Osiris in a jar, again, not touching it directly with their hands, but holding it with the linen of their robes. So the Koyak festivities, the Koyak festival itself, spread out from Egypt all across the Mediterranean in these various ways, largely as part of Isis cults, like you see here. And all of those go back to this practice of trying to performatively bring a good harvest into existence by doing these rituals to ensure that it happens. So you make your figures, you water them, the plants grow out of them, you bury them again the next year, and you do that every year in the hopes that it will force a good Nile flood, that you will have a good agricultural year in order to have a successful crop. And so this is what you have up in your galleries in some of your corn mummies that are found here. These mummies of Osiris that were made out of dirt and seeds and grown and then reburied in the next year as part of this festival that was celebrated all up and down the Nile for thousands of years, and which were intended to, again, remember the god Osiris. Thank you very much.
Well, I have to admit that I didn't know so much about the order of the mysteries of Osiris, and now I know, I didn't even know about the efflux and Osiris's thighs. So this is a whole new experience and thing to look into. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Foy, Betsy, and Emily for great presentations that I'm sure enlightened all of us in one way or another. I'm really delighted that you were all able to join us and grateful for your participation during a week, during an afternoon. And I'm sure you're going to leave with at least something new about Egyptian festivals. And now I'll just finish with those colleagues that are joining us in the temple. After this, there's a group of people. Please feel free to make your way over there through the doors where Elizabeth and Amber will check your name off the list. Thank you again, everyone, for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again. And do go see Divine Egypt if you haven't done so already. Thank you very much.